My number 9 best chess game of the 1960s is Edward Gufeld versus Lubomir Kavalek from the Student Olympiad of 1962. Now, we've already seen a Gufeld brilliancy from our top 10 of the 1970s. However, in this game, he is going to end up on the wrong side of Kavalek's brilliance as he stumbles in the opening and walks into a very, very dangerous piece sacrifice. Kavalek is a player that many might not know, but in 1978 he would become US champion, and he would later be the second to Nigel Short as Nigel Short took on Garry Kasparov for the World Chess Championship. Gufeld opens the game here with pawn to e4, and Kavalek responds with e5. After knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5, we of course have the Spanish game, or Ruy Lopez, one of the oldest openings in modern chess. At this point, Kavalek selects the sharp bishop to c5, but he's just getting started because after c3, he really rocks the board with pawn to f5. Now, this is not a move that I was familiar with, so I had to look it up for this video. It turns out that this is the Cordel Gambit. There are a few things that are scarier than facing a fresh gambit over the board, and that is more true in the 1960s when you don't have very developed opening research and you don't have opening databases, and you definitely don't have a chess engine that you just turn on and it tells you the right move. So after pawn to f5, my instincts are telling me that this is a bad move. Can black really play the pawn forward this early in the game and open lines of attack that lead to the black king? Well, objectively, not really. This is not a good move, but again, hard to disprove it over the board. After pawn to f5, Gufeld responds well initially with pawn to d4. As is often said, a flank attack should be met by a strike in the center of the board. That's true here, and this is an excellent move. But then after pawn takes e4, what modern theoreticians will tell you is that the best response is bishop takes c6. Now, if black captures here on f3, then the bishop can capture back on f3, and white is getting an excellent position. This bishop is still hit. Black's king is feeling very exposed on the light squares. So after bishop takes c6, what makes sense is capturing back, but then after knight takes e5, white just has a very, very nice advantage. Not winning, but the better pawn structure and easy development give the kind of plus that most players don't want to allow when white has to do so little work to get this advantage. In the game, though, Gufeld tries the move knight to g5. Now, this move can still lead to an advantage, but it is getting more complicated. After bishop to b6, the way to get the advantage is knight takes e4 when black can expand with d5. There's queen h5 check, and you don't want to play g6 because this pawn drops. Note that the knight is pinned, so the king has to give up the right to castle. Knight g5 threatens mate over here, but queen e7 meets it with a threat of black's on, so now castles, knight f6 attacks the queen, and queen h4. So this is a fairly long sequence, but it's relatively forced. The upshot is that black has good development and good control of the center, but the fact that the king has lost the right to castle is certainly an issue, and white has a decent advantage. Now the game is going to remain complicated and interesting, but again, white is better. In the game, though, Gufeld tries the move pawn to d5. He's really trying for an opening trap with this move. He's hoping for knight c to e7, moving the attacked knight back, in which case there is knight to e6. And because the d-pawn is pinned, the black queen is just trapped on d8. A hilarious possible finish. But after d5, it is not he who is springing an opening trap. It is in fact he who has fallen into an opening trap. Kavalek springs the trap with pawn to e3. The point here is that black is breaking up the connection between the bishop and the knight on g5. As a result, Gufeld's back is against the wall. He's nearly lost in this position. Now, the best response, a very computer-like and fascinating response, a dirty engine line, is bishop takes e3, when after bishop takes e3, you don't recapture when you would just lose the knight on g5 and have a very bad position. Instead, you play knight to e6, A stunning, brilliant, and again, totally computer-like move. If your opponent plays this, I really would be suspicious that they might be looking at some computer resources. It might be very tempting to follow them to the restroom. Don't do that. That is the arbiter's job. Let them deal with it. In any case, after the move knight to e6, the point here is that you still have these pieces under attack. You are down a piece in the position though, and black can capture the knight on e6, which is the best move. However, after capturing on e6, pawn takes c6. Now, again, white is down a piece, but there are two threats here, capturing on e3 and then capturing on b7. One threat can be dealt with, but not both. Even the trade of queens doesn't really change things. Black needs to deal with the bigger threat, which is capturing on b7. So king to e7, and now pawn takes e3. Now, Kavalek would still be better in this position, but this is a much better chance for Gufeld, and white is not lost here, only a bit worse. In the game, though, after pawn to e3, Gufeld plays knight to e4, probably realizing that things have gone bad, but not finding the better option. Queen h4 is a strong move, attacking the knight, and f2. Queen f3 defends both of these weak points. Now, already capturing on f2 is good, but Kavalek tries knight to f6, and this is actually a mistake that gives Gufeld a chance, his final chance, to get back into the game. After knight f6, knight takes f6, pawn takes f6. What Gufeld should play is bishop takes e3. Now, after bishop takes e3 from black, if you capture back on e3, you're a little bit worse, but not that much. But you can improve here with the move pawn to g3, attacking the queen, still attacking the knight and the bishop, and then you're better off after the queen retreats if you capture with the f-pawn and improve your central structure. Again, Gufeld has gotten out of his difficulties with this complex line. However, he misses that and instead goes ahead and captures the knight on c6. He is accepting a piece sacrifice here, and this is a mistake. He will live to regret this. He will die with a full belly. So, after pawn takes c6, e takes f2 check, the question is where to put the king. There are two relatively sensible options. One is king d1 and one is king f1. Now, king d1 is played in the game, and I understand this move. Kavalek is trying to get away from the center of the board. That seems to make sense. He's worried about his king getting mated. He's thinking that the danger here is really an attack on the king. His opponent has given up a piece for this attack, right? Actually, as the course of the game shows, what's really going to matter, even in an endgame, is the strength of the passed pawns, this pawn on f2. So it made the most sense to play king f1, helping to kind of protect against this pawn's advance, and also providing added protection to g2 later in the game, which we will see can be important. In the game, though, we do see the move king to d1, and after the capture on c6, black is threatening both bishop g4, pinning and winning the queen, and the capture on c6. A tactic here backfires. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, queen takes, does win material for just a second, but after king f7, queen takes a8, there is bishop g4, and the discovery picks up the queen on a8. It is check. So, bishop e2. This is the only move. This does defend the bishop and stop bishop g4. It also has the idea, which is realized on the board, of trading queens after a developing move for black. I imagine Gufeld was very eager to trade queens here, and he does so, but after the queen trade, it's a good moment to kind of pause and assess the position. Even though white still has an extra piece here and the queens are off the board, so he's no longer worried about getting mated, the position is basically winning for Kavalek. The problem is the strength of the pawns. This pawn, yes, but also this pawn. These are connected passed pawns. And g2 is going to be very, very weak. There's going to be no way to defend g2. As black lines up pressure and wins g2, these pawns will become 3 connected passed pawns. Meanwhile, white is struggling to develop, and as a result, he's really paralyzed and lost in this position. Kavalek pushes the king up to e7 and now b3 from Gufeld. I think this move has 2 points. One is bishop a3 check, developing the bishop, and the other is keeping this bishop out of c4, where it could at some point help this pawn promote. So b3, bishop d5, attacking g2, bishop to a3 check, and king up to e6, bishop to g4 check, and this clever maneuver by Gufeld has allowed him to defend g2, but only for a moment. Because of rook g8, the pawn is stuck and it's falling on the next move. So knight d2 developing the knight, bishop takes g2, and now these are 3 connected passed pawns. Yes, 2 of them are doubled, but they're still very, very strong. Bishop takes g2, rook takes g2, and in this position you can't play the king up to e2 because of f1 queen and the knight on d2 falls. So the rook f1 move is necessary to stop this pawn in its tracks, and now the king can come up. Rook to d8 and king to e2. At this point, it seems like Gufeld might be consolidating his position just a little bit. He's got the idea of playing knight c4 and eliminating this very, very strong dark squared bishop. Still, even in that case, these pawns are very strong and he might be lost, but that would be progress, and it would become harder and harder for Kavalek to prove a win. The path would be narrower. Instead, Kavalek finds an excellent move to stop this idea dead in its tracks. Rook takes d2 check, a brilliant and beautiful move. He simply eliminates the knight and says that this bishop and preserving it is the most important thing in the position. The course of the game from here shows that he's basically right. King takes d2, pawn to e4. Now, black isn't going to push this too early, which would allow the king to maybe blockade on the light squares. But next up is going to be f4, f3, and then e3 with check, at which point the pawns are queening. It turns out that there's no good way to defend against this, but Gufeld finds an ingenious try. Bishop to f8. Now, why is he playing bishop to f8? The point is revealed after f4 and then b4. He wants to play bishop c5, but if he had played b4 a moment ago, then his bishop would be blocked in on a3. So he put the bishop on f8 to play b4 and then pull the bishop back to c5, eliminating this bishop. So Kavalek now reveals an incredible idea. Rook to g5, nuking Gufeld's idea. After he follows through with bishop c5, and better was pawn to c4 when black can play bishop e3 check to preserve the bishop. But after bishop c5, Kavalek plays rook takes c5. He just gives up his rook to preserve the power of this bishop and to ensure that the pawns cannot be stopped. This is a winning move. After pawn takes, bishop takes, f3, e3, and e2 are coming, and there's no defense. Another clever try from Gufeld, though. Rook a to b1, f3, of course we don't care about this pawn here, and Gufeld tries rook to b4. Please take me. Of course, that would be the worst possible move in this position. There's no way that Kavalek is going to do that. Instead, he plays king f5, and now rook to d4, trying to cut off this bishop and eliminate this pawn here, but the bishop just takes, pawn takes, and now king to f4. There's no stopping e3, e2, and black is just winning. After rook takes f2 in this position, there is simply e2, and you win the rook, and the endgame is obviously winning for black, who's up 2 pawns in the king and pawn endgame. So Gufeld did resign after king f4 in this beautiful position. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. I really find it thematically instructive. I love how Kavalek insists on the strength of this bishop on b6, twice sacrificing rooks for exchanges to maintain the power of this bishop and to force his pawns through the board. If you want to see more of my favorite games from the 1960s, then click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as we speak.